In 1964, the United States was determined to defend South Vietnam and prevent the expansion of communism in Southeast and East Asia. But the White House was determined to avoid the risk of a wider war, and rejecting the option to withdraw from Southeast Asia, Washington would agonise over its options with no clear conclusion. This channel's mission is to challenge the Vietnam orthodoxy through reference to primary sources. Much of what you know about the Vietnam War is either incomplete or false. Please consider supporting this channel and its mission through Patreon. The link is in the description. On January 22, 1964, the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed a more forceful strategy in a memorandum to Robert S. McNamara, Secretary of Defense. In order to achieve victory, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are of the opinion that the United States must be prepared to put aside many of the self-imposed restrictions which now limit our efforts, and so undertake bolder actions which may embody greater risks. The JCS asked McNamara to discuss the memo with Secretary of State Dean Rusk. They then briefed President Johnson, who asked for specific proposals. The JCS developed these over the next month and gave priority to US airstrikes against the Ho Chi Minh Trail and military and industrial targets in North Vietnam. They considered it unlikely that the Chinese Communists would introduce organised ground units in significant numbers into the DRV, and they doubted that the Soviet Union would initiate action which, in the Soviet judgment, would increase the likelihood of nuclear war. McNamara shared with President Johnson a determination to minimise the risk that US military action would draw Soviet or Chinese ground or air forces into confrontation with the Americans. This concern led to opposition to repeated recommendations for a more rapid intensification of the air war and a more rapid expansion of the ground war. On February 17th, McNamara testified to the House Defense Appropriations Committee on progress in Vietnam. When he was asked about the contradiction in his statement that the US would take all necessary measures within our capability to prevent a communist victory, while describing US policy as one of limited training and support for the South Vietnamese, McNamara responded that the war can be won only by the Vietnamese people themselves, and that among the conditions required to win such a war is a strong, stable and effective government which has the full loyalty and support of the people. 4 days later, on February 21st, President Johnson informed Ambassador Lodge that McNamara would be visiting Saigon in March. McNamara would discuss plans with Lodge for pressure, political and military, against North Vietnam that he and Rusk had been preparing. On the same day, McNamara asked the JCS to examine actions against North Vietnam designed to induce that government to terminate its support and encouragement of the insurrection in South Vietnam and Laos. He asked how China would respond and what US effort would be required to deal with their response. The JCS responded on March 2nd, repeating their position that preventing the loss of South Vietnam was of overriding importance to the security of the United States, and that to achieve that objective, the US should be prepared to destroy military and industrial targets in North Vietnam, mine its harbours, and impose a blockade. The JCS recognised that China might intervene, and that a non-nuclear response might not cause this intervention to stop, and that nuclear attacks would have a far greater probability of doing so. While in South Vietnam, McNamara, under instructions from Johnson, was pictured with General Nguyen Han, leader of a group of younger officers that had staged a coup on January 29th. En route to Saigon, McNamara was asked about the situation in South Vietnam. He replied that, "The situation is serious. We have had 3 governments in 3 months. The Viet Cong have sought to take advantage of the changes and have greatly increased the rate of their attacks." After returning to Washington on March 16th, McNamara reported to the President that the situation in South Vietnam had worsened. The position of the Saigon government had weakened in the past month, and North Vietnamese support for the insurgency had continued to increase. McNamara was also convinced Han did not have political appeal, and his control over the army appeared uncertain. He also discussed alternative options with Johnson. Withdrawal seemed unacceptable, and neutralization would lead to a communist takeover. The JCS proposal for air attacks against North Vietnam was also discussed. The risk of Chinese intervention and the concern that such attacks would not reduce support in the north for communists in South Vietnam was recognised, but the majority of those meeting in Saigon favoured such attacks as there appeared to be no better alternative. McNamara had opposed initiating airstrikes and Han concurred, stating that the Saigon government was not strong enough to withstand possible North Vietnamese retaliation. But McNamara did agree to begin planning for airstrikes. McNamara presented these recommendations to the President, with the agreement of the civilian and military officials who had accompanied him to Saigon. However, Marine Corps Commandant General Wallace Greene and Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay disagreed with his report. Greene believed that if the US was to remain in Vietnam and win, it should pursue that objective with its full power, while LeMay wanted to bomb logistical bases and reinforcement routes in Laos and Cambodia. Dean Rusk agreed with McNamara's recommendations, which were approved by the President. In late March or early April, McNamara was asked by a journalist about possible action in North Vietnam. He replied that, "Whatever ultimate course of action is forced on us by the other side must be thought of as a supplement to, and not a substitute for, progress within South Vietnam." In April, Han changed his mind on bombing. He met with Lodge on May 4th, suggesting that North Vietnam might be warned that further interference in the south would lead to retaliation, and he asked whether the US would be prepared to bomb the north. McNamara met with Han on May 13th. Han believed Op Plan 34 Alpha was not effective, and would not result in Hanoi ending support for the insurgency in the south. He also reversed his position on the weakness of the south. That would now be a reason to take action, rather than a reason not to. But before McNamara left Saigon, Han again changed his mind. He wasn't ready to use South Vietnamese aircraft to bomb the north, and he didn't want to use US aircraft. But Lodge wanted strikes against the north. He wanted to cut off the infiltration of men and supplies from North Vietnam, and to destroy the will of Hanoi to continue supporting the insurgency in the south. The CIA submitted a special intelligence assessment on May 15th. The overall situation in South Vietnam remains extremely fragile. If the tide of deterioration has not been arrested by the end of the year, the anti-communist position in South Vietnam is likely to become untenable. With no other plan, it was decided to extend Op Plan 34 Alpha operations, which had been scheduled for termination on the 31st. The President asked State and Defence to prepare a plan for graduated political and military action against North Vietnam, with State drafting a congressional resolution for action in Indochina. A draft resolution, prepared by a small group under George Bull, was submitted to the NSC on May 24th. The draft was debated at an NSC meeting that day without the President, which recognised the risks of bombing the North or sending US combat forces to South Vietnam. Maxwell Taylor believed the South would not lose quickly, and the US military would therefore prefer to wait until autumn before expanding action. He wanted the matter discussed further with Ambassador Lodge, Commerce MacV General William Westmoreland, and SINCPAC Admiral US Grant Sharp in Honolulu. The meeting convened in Honolulu on June 1st. The mood was gloomy, with the exception of Lodge, who believed the situation would improve. A proposed action plan, drafted in Washington but not approved, was discussed. A congressional resolution and communication with Hanoi would be followed by graduated military pressures, leading to limited air attacks against North Vietnam. The attacks would be carried out by South Vietnamese forces as much as possible. A special national intelligence estimate had concluded there was a reasonable chance the plan would cause North Vietnam to reduce the level of the insurgency, but it stressed that Hanoi might resist such pressures. In connection with the plan, 4 points were discussed. Saigon was not ready to mount air attacks against the north, and would be vulnerable to attacks from the north for several months. The deployment of several US divisions to counter the possibility of Chinese intervention seemed appropriate. The American public were unconvinced of Southeast Asia's importance to US security. and a congressional resolution was required to demonstrate US resolve and gain public support. However, the conference ended without conclusion, and no decision was made on the proposed action plan. At the start of August, the CIA Board of National Estimates replied to an inquiry the President had made some days earlier, concerning the domino effect on East Asia of the loss of South Vietnam and Laos to the Communists. The loss of South Vietnam and Laos to the Communists would be profoundly damaging to the US position in the Far East. Failure here would seriously debase the credibility of US will and capability to contain the spread of communism elsewhere in the area. Our enemies would be encouraged, and there would be an increased tendency among other states to move toward a greater degree of accommodation with the Communists. It continued, the chief effect would be upon Communist China, raising its self-confidence and in raising its prestige as a leader of world communism. The outcome in South Vietnam and Laos would conspicuously support the aggressive tactical contentions of Beijing as contrasted with the more cautious position of the USSR. To some degree, this will tend to encourage and strengthen the more activist, revolutionary movements in various parts of the underdeveloped world. In the early hours of August 2, 1964, the duty officer in the White House Situation Room prepared a report for President Johnson. Mr. President, early this morning the USS Maddox was attacked by 3 DRV-PT boats while on patrol approximately 30 miles off the North Vietnamese coast in the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson called a meeting that morning with key advisors, Secretary Rusk, Under-Secretary Ball, Deputy Secretary of Defense Vance, General Wheeler of the Joint Chiefs, and experts in technical intelligence. The meeting concluded that the attack had been a mistake, and President Johnson decided not to retaliate. Ambassador Taylor opposed the decision. He believed the failure to respond was an indication that the US flinches from direct confrontation with the North Vietnamese. The President ordered the DeSoto patrol to continue, adding a second destroyer, the Turner Joy, and broadcast a warning on Voice of America to Hanoi that grave consequences would result from any further unprovoked military action. Senators and representatives designated to oversee intelligence operations were briefed on Op Plan 34 Alpha operations, including the American supporting role, and in a closed session with members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on August 3rd, Secretary of Defense McNamara described the operations and why the President had decided not to retaliate for the August 2nd incident. A few minutes after 9 p.m. on August 4th, McNamara informed the President that a message had been intercepted indicating the North Vietnamese were preparing a second attack. McNamara kept Johnson informed as more information arrived from Pacific Command headquarters. At 11:40, McNamara met with Dean Rusk, McGeorge Bundy, and the JCS to discuss options. At 12:30 p.m, Rusk, McNamara, Curtis LeMay of the JCS, and McGeorge Bundy arrived at the White House from meetings at the Pentagon, and Deputy Secretary of Defense Cyrus Vance arrived from the Pentagon a few minutes later. McNamara briefed the meeting on the latest information, and that he and Rusk were developing a set of responses. Johnson asked Rusk, McNamara, Vance, McCone and Bundy to join him for lunch, and their unanimous view was that the second attack could not be ignored. The President agreed, and the group decided on airstrikes against North Vietnamese PT boats, their bases, and a strike on an oil depot. At 1:27 p.m, a message from Captain John J. Herrick, patrol commander on board the Maddox, was received in Washington. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and over-eager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. No actual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken. But at 2:08 p.m, Admiral Sharp told Birchinall that despite this message, he was in no doubt the attack had occurred, and at 2:48 p.m, a second message was received from Herrick. He was certain that original ambush was bona fide. During the afternoon, more intelligence reports were received. Messages had been intercepted that 2 enemy aircraft had been fired on, with one damaged, that 2 comrades had been sacrificed, and that enemy vessel perhaps wounded. The conclusion reached was that the North Vietnamese were aware of the attack. However, some of the later reports from Pacific Command and the destroyers questioned the firing of torpedoes, and Johnson asked McNamara to investigate and obtain clarification. McNamara contacted Admiral Sharp, Sinkpack, who in turn contacted the Maddocks. He then reported to McNamara that he was in no doubt the attack had taken place. McNamara and his civilian and military specialists had reached the same conclusion. Johnson called another NSC meeting at the White House at 6:15 p.m. He wanted to discuss the incident in detail and plans for a sharp but limited response. McNamara outlined the evidence and presented the proposed response. The meeting concurred with the proposal, and the President authorised the launch of carrier aircraft. Johnson, McNamara, Dean Rusk, and the new JCS chairman, General Earl G. Wheeler, met with congressional leaders at 6:45 p.m. They were briefed on events and the planned response. The President wanted a congressional resolution of support for the position in Southeast Asia. He wanted to strengthen his hand if he was forced into further action. Johnson was uncertain how Hanoi would react to retaliatory airstrikes. Several outcomes were possible, including an invasion of South Vietnam by the north and Chinese intervention on the side of Hanoi. He wanted firm congressional support for any action that might be required. McNamara explained what had happened in the Gulf and what the administration proposed in response. Johnson then read the statement he planned to deliver to the American people that evening. Senator Everett Saltonstall observed that the President had used the word limited 3 times in his speech. Johnson explained that he wanted Hanoi to understand that though the US would not take it lying down, it would not destroy its cities. Rusk added that he thought it an advantage that the statement would leave Hanoi in no doubt that we are not doing this as a pretext for a larger war. Rusk went on to describe the nature of the desired resolution and explained that it applied to the whole of Southeast Asia. The senators and representatives were supportive, and near the end of the discussion, Speaker McCormack stated that a united front was being presented. Johnson informed Barry Goldwater, the Republican presidential candidate, of the events and what was planned. McNamara had expected Johnson to go on television and radio at 9 p.m. He wanted news of the strikes to come from the US government rather than Hanoi, and he wanted it understood that the strikes were bound for North Vietnam and not China. His announcement was made at 11:37 p.m. The next morning, Johnson flew to Syracuse, New York, to dedicate the new House Journalism building at Syracuse University. He used his speech to explain the meaning of the events in the Gulf of Tonkin and the basis for policy in Vietnam. There is no threat to any peaceful power from the United States, but there can be no peace by aggression and no immunity from reply. When he returned to Washington, Rusk presented a draft of the Southeast Asia Resolution, better known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. He had worked on the draft with George Ball, in consultation with congressional leaders of both parties. Johnson approved it and prepared a written message to accompany the draft. In the message, he made it clear he was not just asking for the support of Congress with regard to reply to attacks on US forces, but to do what was required to fulfill US responsibilities in Southeast Asia. During the debate in the Senate, Senator Cooper asked, "If the President decided that it was necessary to use such force as could lead into war, will we give that authorization by this resolution?" When Senator Fulbright, one of the 4 senators that had introduced the resolution, confirmed this position, Cooper stated, "It is well for the country and all of us to know what is being undertaken." The Southeast Asia Resolution was passed in Congress on August 7th, 88-2 in the Senate and 416-0 in the House. McGeorge Bundy sent the President a memo on possible courses of action in Southeast Asia on August 13th. The memo reflected the consensus in the State and Defense Departments. Military action, from expanded covert operations to US airstrikes against the North, and its supply lines to the South were listed. The Saigon leadership displayed symptoms of defeatism, creating pressure to either introduce US forces or to seriously consider a negotiated solution, which in the circumstances would amount to surrender. The only clear recommendation was to oppose any conference on Vietnam, as negotiation without continued military action will not achieve our objectives in the foreseeable future. The memo came to form the basis of sometimes acrimonious debate for the following 5 months. Using air power against North Vietnam had been discussed inside the government and in Saigon for some time, but no formal proposal for an airstrike campaign had been presented to Johnson. Advisors were concerned airstrikes might trigger intervention by China, an increase in international tensions by the Soviet Union, or that Hanoi might launch an invasion of the South or increase the intensity of the guerrilla war in South Vietnam, which American officials in Washington and Saigon believed the Saigon government and military could not survive. Maxwell Taylor had replaced Cabot Lodge as ambassador in Saigon in July, and in early September, Johnson asked Taylor to return to Washington to review the situation. He wanted to hear his opinion on the political situation in Saigon, and he wanted those in Washington urging further military action to understand the base the US would be operating from should their advice be taken. Maxwell Taylor cabled Washington on September 6th. Only the emergence of an exceptional leader could improve the situation. A special national intelligence estimate was not hopeful. The odds are against the emergence of a stable government capable of effectively prosecuting the war in South Vietnam. On September 9th, Johnson met with Taylor, Rusk, McNamara, General Wheeler, McCone and Bundy. Several specific actions developed by states and defence after consulting with Taylor were discussed. One proposal was to resume the De Soto patrols, and to be prepared to retaliate against North Vietnam in the event of an attack on US forces or a special attack by the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong against South Vietnam. McNamara reported that the proposals had the support of the JCS, but while Wheeler said the Army and Navy had been persuaded by Taylor that drastic action might produce a strong reaction from the Communists, a reaction Saigon might not withstand, the Air Force and Marine Corps wanted extensive airstrikes against the North. President Johnson asked if anyone doubted that Vietnam was worth all this effort. Taylor responded that we could not afford to allow Hanoi to win in the interests of our overall position in Asia and in the world. Wheeler supported this view and reported that it was the unanimous position of the JCS that if South Vietnam was lost, the US would eventually lose Southeast Asia to China, the rising power in the region. McCone and Rusk agreed. Everyone present agreed with the military recommendations. The advisors were confident the limited actions would convince Hanoi the US was committed to the defence of South Vietnam, reassure Saigon, and perhaps inhibit an increase in the North's activities in the South. Johnson concluded the discussion with the statement that the first objective was to strengthen South Vietnam. George Ball sent a 62-page memo to McNamara, Dean Rusk and McGeorge Bundy on October 5th. He began by stating that the political situation in Saigon had deteriorated, and it seemed unlikely a government strong enough to overcome the insurgency would emerge. He suggested 4 options for US policy: continue the current course of action, take control of the war, mount an air offensive against the North, or work towards a political settlement. In analysing each course of action, Ball believed the current course of action would lead to a downward spiral. Taking over the war would lead to heavy US losses. Bombing the North would be ineffective, and as no attention had been given to the 4th option, a political settlement, a study should be undertaken on the question without delay. He also questioned the idea that offensive action could be taken while controlling the risks. Once on the tiger's back, we cannot be sure of picking the place to dismount. Ball argued that a negotiated settlement should include the effective commitment of North Vietnam to stop the insurgency in the South, the establishment of an independent government in Saigon that was capable of overcoming the remaining insurgency once Hanoi had ceased its direct support. Recognition that the government of the South remained free to call for the assistance of the United States or any other friendly power if it should again need assistance. And enforceable guarantees of the independence of the Saigon government by other signatory powers. McNamara, Rusk and Bundy endorsed the objectives, but agreed that a political solution without the means to achieve it was like advocating unconditional withdrawal. Towards the end of the month, as the situation continued to deteriorate in South Vietnam, the JCS sent McNamara a memo. They were concerned and proposed a new, intensive program of military action, including air operations over North and South Vietnam, and asked McNamara to forward the memo to the President. McNamara met with Wheeler on November 1st. Wheeler told him that the chiefs felt so strongly that they believed if the President did not authorize expanded military action, that the US should withdraw. When asked to comment on the proposal, Maxwell Taylor disagreed. He believed it was a departure from the long-standing principle that the Vietnamese fight their own war in South Vietnam. Weeks before, Westmoreland cabled that, unless there are reasonable prospects of a fairly effective government in South Vietnam in the immediate offing, then no amount of offensive action by the US, either in or outside South Vietnam, has any chance by itself of reversing the deterioration now underway. The next day, Johnson set up a working group under William Bundy, with instructions to review policy alternatives. After 4 weeks, the group produced a draft. We cannot guarantee to maintain a non-communist South Vietnam short of committing ourselves to whatever degree of military action would be required to defeat North Vietnam and probably Communist China. The chiefs downplayed the risks, as they believed they were more acceptable than continuing the present course of action or withdrawal. However, Johnson and McNamara were determined to avoid such risks. On November 1st, the Viet Cong attacked the airbase at Bien Hoa with mortars, cut through the perimeter wire, and destroyed 5 aircraft and damaged more. The JCS and Ambassador Taylor urged a retaliatory strike against the North, while McNamara and Rusk disagreed. Johnson decided against retaliating, concerned about the weakness of the South Vietnamese government and military, and possible Viet Cong action against US dependence in Saigon. For the same reasons, despite strong urging from Taylor to retaliate by bombing the North, Johnson decided not to take action when a US officers' billet in downtown Saigon was bombed on Christmas Eve, killing a number of Americans and Vietnamese. But his concern was growing steadily. The goal of the US was an end to the support of Hanoi for communist violence in the South. However, by the end of 1964, North Vietnamese regulars were detected in South Vietnam, not as replacements for Viet Cong units, but in organised main force battalions. Johnson had returned from the LBJ ranch on December 1st. He met with his senior advisors and Maxwell Taylor, who had joined the meeting from Saigon, to discuss the working group's recommendations. A. Continue the present course, with little hope of avoiding defeat. B. Initiate a sharp and intensive bombing campaign, aimed at North Vietnam's communication lines to the south and the 94 target list, with the goal of forcing Hanoi to stop supporting the insurgency in the south or enter negotiations, or both. And C. Start a graduated bombing campaign with the same goal, but at a lower risk of a larger war. McNaughton and Bundy favoured the third option, but the meeting was divided. The JCS wanted B, Maxwell Taylor A, with gradual movement towards C, and Westmoreland favoured continuing with option A for 6 months. A CIA report underlined the view of the JCS that the transportation system and industrial base in North Vietnam was vulnerable to bombing, but because the North's economy was agricultural and decentralised, bombing would not create economic problems Hanoi could not overcome, and it would not inhibit the ability to send enough men and material to the south to continue the war. The CIA also reported that the Hanoi leadership believed the South Vietnamese government was close to collapse, and with victory close they would endure substantial bombing without changing course. Johnson decided to give Maxwell Taylor a final chance to achieve political stability in the South, and if that failed, he would then talk to Wheeler about bombing the North. He also approved a two-phase plan: armed reconnaissance flights against infiltration routes in Laos, and reprisal strikes against North Vietnam in response to attacks on US targets. And Taylor would use the prospect of the second phase, an air campaign against North Vietnam, to encourage Saigon to strengthen its political base. When another coup was thwarted, Taylor reported in his year-end appraisal that, if worst comes to worst, we might seek to disengage from the present relationship with the GVN, withdrawing the bulk of our advisors. The President expressed frustration with the repeated requests from the JCS for permission to bomb the North. He didn't think the war would be won from the air and believed that appropriate military strength on the ground would be much more effective. He was ready to look with great favour on that kind of increased American effort. Maxwell Taylor responded with his analysis from Saigon. We are faced with a deteriorating situation. Political turmoil, irresponsibility and division within the armed forces, discouragement and lack of morale. Unless these conditions are somehow changed, we are likely soon to face installation of a hostile government which will ask us to leave while it seeks accommodation with the National Liberation Front and Hanoi. There is a comparatively short time fuse on this situation. He also cautioned the President that on a standard military measure, a massive troop deployment would be required to defeat the insurgency. The Viet Cong enjoys the priceless asset of a protected logistic sanctuary in the DRV and in Laos. He did not recall a successful anti-guerrilla campaign with less than a 10-to-1 numerical superiority over the guerrillas, and without the elimination of assistance from outside the country. Taylor stressed that ratio had not exceeded 5-to-1 in the previous 2 years, and it seemed unlikely a satisfactory ratio would be achieved in the future. He believed that to achieve results, a new element had to be introduced, and that only a graduated series of air attacks against the North appeared to offer any prospect of success. His goal was to break the will of Hanoi to continue the war. He ended the telegram with the observation that we are presently on a losing track and must risk a change. To take no positive action now is to accept defeat in the fairly near future.